We are good.
Good. Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's July 2nd, 2021. I've hijacked the show from Rob Grant. I'm probably wrong about everything, and we're rewording it to I'm probably right about everything, but we're spelling right with the W-I-T-E. So it's an honor and a pleasure to let us hijack your show, Rob Grant and Dillion Bustin. What an honor and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to join you, and I thank you for the invitation.
Okay, here's the first round robin question. We'll start with the youngin. Are we making it happen or are we watching it happen? Rob.
I think we're making it happen.
Good. Okay, Dillion.
I'd say we're watching it happen. I don't have I don't have any sense myself of having any agency or power to influence anything, and I'm trained, as an ethnographer, which just means sit back and hush up and watch. So yes, I think I'm more of an observer.
Beautiful. What's an ethnographer and how do you spell that, Dillion?
Ethno grapher, grapher, and it's Greek. It just means somebody who writes about people. Ethno is people, graphia is writing. So an ethnographer is an anthropologist or a folklorist or a cultural geographer who observes and describes.
Dude, you must have ESP because that's why I changed the name of Rob's show to Right. W-R-T, and I didn't even know. I didn't even know you were going to say that right off the bat. So, this book by Yuval Harari, Homo Deus, he sort of made a big splash with a big pop psychology book or anthropology book. I don't know what it's called. His question was, what's more valuable, intelligence or consciousness? Dillion, how would you answer that? And is there a better way to ask that question?
Well, I think consciousness is one of the great mysteries remaining to us in science. There's been a lot done to explicate the brain, and there's been a lot done to explicate zoology and studying animals and debating how much consciousness they have in the sense of self-consciousness. But no one has explained self-consciousness.
Yeah, beautifully well put. And Rob, how would you answer that? What's more valuable, intelligence or consciousness? And if you needed to reword the question, how would you do it?
Well, I mean, I'm all about terms and understanding them, and that ultimately I don't know how much I really do understand. But there's a popular self-help book, one of the first ones of the early 20th century, and it was called "As a Man Thinketh, He Becomes." And so I wonder if, as we've communicated over the years and we've shared ideas and we've developed our lexicon and our language, that maybe we created our own consciousness. Perhaps. I don't know. I mean, it seems that all animals have pain receptors, or we're trying to argue that all animals have sentience.
Yes.
Again, I'm horrible with words, but I think that, like, what exactly is intelligence? Is intelligence our creations? So perhaps what's better is our ability to think or our ability to create? Or is thinking synonymous with creation? So I don't know. I think that consciousness is very important, though, because it's allowed us to carry on our stories. So there's my long-winded answer.
That was good. We welcome long-winded answers, anecdotes, and stories. So, Dillion, did you want to respond to Rob at all, Dillion?
Well, I would just add that, beyond stimulus response kind of behavioralist research, you cannot be intelligent without consciousness. So I would say consciousness is more important.
Yeah, very good. And I wanted to delve into Emerson and Thoreau a little, Dylan, since you've been studying them for years. Just off the top of your head, in layperson's terms, how did you first get into Emerson, and what was it that he taught you or enlightened you with? You know, just how would you summarize that briefly?
It's such an archetypical story. It may be hard to believe, but I was born and raised in Indiana. My father had grown up in Boston. He had one relative in the area from Boston who was his Aunt Tizzy. And Aunt Tizzy had originally been from Boston. But in the 1930s, there was a young man from Indiana who went out to Boston looking for work during the Depression. And he was a steel sheet metal worker, fabricator. And his name was Ward Shortridge, and they married. And after things improved, they went back to Indiana. So my Aunt Tizzy was like this New England lady living on a farm in Indiana. And she was a little bit out of place, but that farm was extremely important to me growing up. And we were over there all the time. So on their fireplace mantle was a complete set of Emerson's collected works. All the essays, all the poetry, all his early sermons, everything, which she had brought from New England to this outpost in rural Indiana. And every Sunday dinner, my Uncle Ward would take down Emerson and read from him before we could begin the meal. So that was my introduction to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Readings at the Sunday dinner table.
Beautiful. What was the main impact or enlightenment did you get from him early on that said this guy is worth pursuing for many decades?
Well, I would say that he wrote memorable sentences. The rap on Emerson is there was nobody better at writing sentences, but he could not write a coherent paragraph. So his essays are just one little nugget after another. In fact, I just checked Wikipedia to see what Wikipedia would have about Emerson. And he said, what he's known for? He's known for saying, build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. This is not a good summary of Ralph Waldo Emerson, but that's what he's remembered for. Or lines like, there's a line from poetry that says, things are in the saddle and ride mankind. And that is quoted in every biography of Emerson. It's very concise and it's very memorable, but it's from a larger essay that's largely incomprehensible. So I recognized him early on as great little epigrams, but of his bigger ideas, let's say, he had the idea of the oversoul, which was the result of his reading Hindu Vedas. And at that time in the 19th century, in the 1830s, 40s, that Hindu Vedas were just being translated from Sanskrit into German. So if you wanted to read them as an American, you had to read them in German, which he could do, but he was one of the few people who could do that. So he was studying this Veda called the Vishnu Purana, and he was getting a lot of ideas from that, which were compatible with his developing ideas of transcendentalism. That, if you look at the three major Hindu gods, Krishna, Shiva, Brahma, there's one above them, which was called Brahman. And Brahman was just the ground of consciousness that was the foundation of the universe. So Emerson wrote a poem, and this is what a beginner he was in the study of Hinduism. He got the title wrong. He meant to say Brahman, but he titled it Brahma, which is one of the three lesser gods. And that's the one that starts out, if the red slayer thinks that he slays, or if the slain think that they are slain, they know not well the subtle ways I keep and pass and turn again. Far and forgot to me are near. Sunshine and shadow is the same. And on with this very epigrammatic, very contemporary language. He doesn't say far awayness and forgetfulness to me are near. He just says far and forgot to me are near, which is like E.E. Cummings, use of language. It's very contemporary. But that sort of idea, the red slayer is Shiva, and so if a military mercenary thinks he kills you, or if you think you've been killed, you don't get the big picture.
So, I mean, it's like you Dylan. One thing that resonated with me was McLuhan said, a half a truth is still a lot of a truth. So even though, and also it's like, you mean my whole fallacy's wrong. There's a lot of crossover in my study with McLuhan in what Emerson said in these quips or maxims. And we're going to get to that. But again, what would you summarize in a layperson's term, one major insight or enlightenment that you got from studying Emerson for yourself?
Well, at heart, all world religions are the same. Like after that poem was published, and it was published in newspapers all over the country, his daughter, Ellen, came to him and said, Dad, you're embarrassing us. Everybody's talking about you. Nobody knows what you're talking about. She's a teenager and she's saying, my friends are like shunning me because you're such a weirdo. And he said, just tell them to reread it or reread the essay on the Oversoul or anything I've written. And every time I refer to Brahman, just slot in the word Jehovah, and it will be perfectly understandable to a Protestant Christian.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying that his take on religion has affected you personally, Dylan, in that it's something worth pursuing.
Yes, and it led me directly to Unitarianism. I was raised, when I was young, we went to a United Brethren church. And United Brethren in the Midwest was a denomination that derived from Moravian pacifists from Germany who were missionaries to Native Americans and who moved west from the East Coast with Native Americans. And so this little town, which was Acton, Indiana, had a United Brethren church, which we attended. In the 60s, I think in the early 60s, like 61, they merged with the Methodists to become the United Methodists. So my adolescence and teenage years, I went to a Methodist church. But if you ever see a sign that says United Methodist Church, that was because they merged with the United Brethren.
Got it.
So, I went to Sunday school and I tried to understand God. And for me, God became more and more abstract, and Emerson was very helpful in feeling comfortable with that.
With the abstraction, yeah. Rob, if you have a question or a comment, you raise your hand so I don't just dominate this. Feel free.
Oh no, I'm taking notes. I'm a student of this one, my friend.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do find that what an amazing paradox. Understand God. The more you try to understand God, likely the less you'll understand.
Yes, and the same with religion in general. I found when I was 14, my after-school job was being the janitor at church. So this was the new United Methodist Church, and it was a new building. But I would take a different school bus. I'd get off there, and I would sweep and mop the Sunday school rooms, and I would vacuum the sanctuary and throw out the old flowers and get ready for the new flowers. And part of my job was to fill the christening bowl before a Sunday where there was going to be a baptism, christening. So the minister came to me and he said, "You're not vacuuming up around the altar area where the crucifix is." And I said, I can't vacuum up that. That's like holy, you know. I can't take a vacuum cleaner up there and disturb that. And he said, "Yes, you can. Just vacuum the whole sanctuary. Don't worry about the crucifix. It's not going to hurt you." So I said, "Well, by the way, where do I get the holy water for the christenings?" And he said, "Out of the water fountain in the hall."
Oh.
I said, "I can't use that. It's got to be holy water." He says, "It becomes holy water when I say it's holy water, you know." Yeah. Other than that, it's just out of the water fountain. So I gradually became more and more disenchanted with organized religion. And Emerson was also helpful about that. You know, his father had been a minister, grandfather, great-grandfather. Many of his ancestors, going back to Puritan times, had been ministers. That was the last thing he wanted to do. As a young man, he intended to be a school teacher. And then he had one crisis after another, and finally decided to go to Harvard Divinity School, and he did become a minister.
But you personally never checked out officially. You still are a practicing, let's say, religious or spiritual person. How would you word that?
Well, I started attending a Unitarian service during high school. Because my father moved the family from Indiana to Massachusetts. So I was suddenly in the hotbed mother lode of Unitarianism in the suburbs west of Boston. And the girl I was interested in during senior year, whose name was Beverly Conant. Conant is a really old family name from Salem, Massachusetts. And her people went straight back to the Puritans, but they were Unitarians, and she started taking me to Unitarian service. And also we would go to Star Island, which was a Unitarian retreat center, conference center on an island off the coast of New Hampshire. So she was my introduction to Unitarianism. And it felt much better. I mean, I got in so much trouble from my parents for starting to go to Unitarian services. And now I live in Maine, where there are only a handful of Unitarian churches, and they're all in the major cities. It was a religion, even in Emerson's time, it was a religion of the elite, you know, of very affluent people and well-established people and well-connected people. The working class version of that was the Universalist church. And almost all the congregations here in Maine are Universalist in origin, because the Unitarians and the Universalists also merged at a certain time to become the Unitarian Universalist Church. But historically, Universalists were more working class and Unitarians were more upper class. Now they just call UUs, right? UUs. And I feel, I realized that I was a closet Universalist the whole time, but in Massachusetts, the only option was to go to a Unitarian church where we lived.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to get to your point, the UU movement is a very inclusive movement because they have no dogma. They have no doctrine that you have to swear to before you can become a member. So in every UU congregation I've ever been a part of, there are refugees from Islam, from Judaism, from the Catholic Church, from the Baptists, and it's all just open-minded people who are all agnostic who find common ground. I think it's hard for human beings to say, I don't know what the ultimate truth is. I don't know what our ultimate fate is. I don't know about an afterlife. I have a sense of virtue and duty, and I'm just going on that, and I'm going with the rest of you folks. Let's just be together in our uncertainties. That's what UUism is. And so Emerson sort of led the way, was among the leaders into Unitarianism, but eventually it became too dogmatic for him, and he left the ministry.
Yeah.
And the issue for him was communion. In the 1830s, in Massachusetts, Unitarian churches still administered communion, with the wafer and the wine and everything. And when you put the host under the silver dish, supposedly it does transmogrify into the body and blood of Christ. And Emerson, who had to administer that, just looked at it. Eventually, he had to say out loud, that, my friends, is magic, and I'm not a magician.
And it was too dogmatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And too ritualistic.
Yeah, that's why being raised a Roman Catholic, we practiced with Necco wafers, which was little candy.
Yeah.
But I've attended these community gatherings that you've had, or these services that you've gone to, Dylan, and shared the commonality of song and discussion. So it is great bringing people together, like Rob brought us three together. But I had to take one step back and show you your talk about holy water. This is what I dumpster dove in Venice, California.
Is that a flask?
It's a plastic bottle of holy water. And I said, boy, I'm going to treasure this. Someone threw this out in the garbage. I mean, that is valuable.
Yes.
And,
that's art right there. That's art right there.
It's priceless.
It's priceless. I could have helped you back then, but the great Lord Buckley, who was a jazz shaman and an influence on so many great comedians from George Carlin on and Robin Williams, he had a joke that went, that church that you were sweeping up at, they would have these little collections of candles, and you could go in and drop a quarter and light a candle for your aunt who's sick, or for some wish you wanted to help propagate and have God, help somebody, some help. And you drop the quarter in there and light the candle. And so one day the sinner, let's call him the sinner, was in there, and he was checking out the little money collection, and he realized that he could open it up and steal all the money. And so he's in there, pilfering the money from the candles, and God's voice comes up from the sky, or from that altar you wouldn't go on and vacuum, and he says, God says, "What are you doing there, sinner?" And the sinner looked up, he says, "Oh God, I'm sorry." He goes, "But if I wasn't doing this, you wouldn't have a job." So let's go on this moral obligations thing. Our artists, writers, that's what Thoreau, who Emerson spawned. Thoreau wrote Waldo, important writer. Emerson was a writer. Do writers have moral obligations? And do the consumers of art and literature have moral obligations? The conflict that I'm trying to deal with or navigate is that it seems all the great, powerful artworks, books, are people talking about their suffering and their pain and their failure. And so it's like, are you propagating this? Are you empowering falling? And how does that suss out in the big picture with Emerson and Thoreau moral obligation? Like, do they? I'll give you that. This is a good example. John Waldo, famous film director, rooted for the Wicked Witch of the West when he watched The Wizard of Oz. Now, most normal people weren't rooting for the bad person. They were rooting for the good person. So was he wrong? He made these incredibly gross films, but I would consider him an important filmmaker. Can you discuss this phenomenon of moral obligations in both the creator and the consumer?
Well, I would start by saying that when we were kids, and in my family, the only night of the year we got to stay up late was when The Wizard of Oz was on. My sister's favorite character by far were the flying monkeys.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. And they were evil. I would say if a writer is writing fiction, or if a writer is writing opinion, they have no obligation to help society or tell the truth. If a writer is supposedly a journalist reporting facts, then they have a duty not to distort the truth or not to disseminate disinformation.
Yeah. And then how about the user? Is the content, is what McLuhan said, like your sister rooting for the evil flying monkeys? Is that a failing of hers, or is she's just what's going on there in regards to moral obligation?
Nothing. I would just say it's one more indication that the movie is good entertainment. Because it has characters in it that are compelling for one reason or another.
Yeah, that's Billy Wilder said, "I just hope the audience likes my movie as much as they like the popcorn."
Right. You could make as many movies as you wanted about Glenda, the good witch, and nobody would watch them.
Yeah.
It's like when Gregory Maguire wrote Wicked, which was the stage adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. It wasn't about the good witch. It was about the bad witch.
Yeah.
And what was cool about Wicked was that it explained the rise to her villainy. And then it makes you understand. It's like every good villain has a reason for being a villain.
Yes.
But that's also why the Joker in Batman is such a provocative villain, is because you never know his origin like you do, Two-Face or Darth Vader, all these other people, is like,
Right.
there's always a mystery of how did that person become that person?
Yes.
Well,
And would you say it's true that it usually has to do with their father?
It's seemingly so, yeah.
Their relationship with their father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Rob, you can touch on that with your dad, because he was a powerful character in your upbringing, and you can touch on that. But this is good. What do you think, Rob? Is the artist like? Do you have a different take, or you agree with Dillion here? The moral obligation of the creator and the moral obligation of the consumer. Any comment, Rob?
I think that in this day and age, we need disclaimers for when we drink hot coffee, like caution, hot. You know what I mean? It's like, no shit. But somebody sued somebody because they dropped hot coffee on their lap, and they're like, hey, this is scorching hot. I got what I was asking for. What's wrong with you? Which is absurd. But with fiction and nonfiction, perhaps we need to add disclaimers saying, warning, this might not be 100% accurate. So, when you read Catcher in the Rye, maybe don't act like this character. Which I've never actually read Catcher in the Rye, but I know that that's a very provocative character.
That's right.
And that serial killers have said, well, I read Catcher in the Rye, that's why I did it. And it's like, that's no excuse, right?
Yeah.
So I think that perhaps the authors need to protect themselves by saying, hey, this is a book. You might get ideas from this, but don't materialize it, or be careful what you put into material action, right? But I'm not taking responsibility for your bad behavior.
Right. Or politicians that put out their ideology, which is tilted one way or another, put a warning on it saying, caution, this is propaganda.
Well, that's another great, I want to talk about semiotics a little, Dillion, too, but a great influence on McLuhan was Jacques Ellul, who said propaganda is just culture in action. So if you do the Rob method and put a warning, what you're doing is helping people focus on that. If you just put art out, and then the consumer is going to use it no matter what, the right way, the wrong way, or some other way. It's no longer the creator's piece, or once the creator, the artist, makes something, it's no longer theirs. It is the users. They can misuse it, use it. They can do whatever they want with it.
Question. So the Rite of Spring, which was that musical that came out like 1912 or something, it's Stravinsky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Apparently when that came out, it caused a riot in Paris, which makes you think like, okay, so let's just put this art out there, and then we have these civilized people who they watch it and they're like having convulsions or whatever was going on when they saw this. Then afterwards they're like, we need to start a riot. Like, what was going on in their collective consciousness? Because obviously a riot requires more than one person. Otherwise, it's just, a guy being crazy or a person being crazy. So I wonder what was going on in the psyche of people as they watched the Rite of Spring for the first time. And it's not like Stravinsky came out and said, hey, just so you guys know, this is a very primitive thing you're about to see that might affect you.
Well, as I understand it, the uproar began amongst the audience and spilled out into the street. So I believe what they were responding to was that Stravinsky was breaking rules of harmony and meter. The music is discordant, and it's intentionally discordant, which in his mind was consistent with the 20th century, and he was finding rules so he could bend them and break them. But if you think of a typical chord in Western diatonic music as being the first tone, the third tone, and the fifth tone, and then maybe the seventh above that, or if you start on the sixth note of the scale, it becomes a minor tone because the whole steps and half steps fall into place differently. And when we hear that, it sounds harmonious. But if you put a 1 note and a 4 note and a 5.5 note together, it's going to sound, if you're not used to it, it sounds awful. It's actually offensive to your ears. The nerve impulses that your ears are sending to your brain, the brain does not want to accept. So that was happening, and at the same time, he was breaking rules of meter. So it felt jagged, and it sounded jagged, and the audience was offended. Like, what in hell do you think you're doing?
Yeah.
That's not music.
Now, fast forward that 100 years later, and we would never have Jurassic Park or Jaws without that kind of music, right?
Yeah,
Which
right.
now kids are like, I want to see Jurassic World. And it's like, it's totally lost its power, I guess.
That's right.
I mean, because
That's
it's
right.
like Jurassic Park 47. Now it's commonly accepted. And the music of those films is very much so influenced by the Rite of Spring.
Right.
But now it's like our body has perhaps adjusted to it.
Well, if you grow up and you have occasion to hear that occasionally, as you develop, then you can naturalize it. But if you hear it for the first time as a grown adult, it feels like a slap in the face.
Igor said, most people don't know what they like what they know. So
Exactly.
they're comfortable with that, and then they learn to shift their aesthetic, and they get more of that. I mean, Igor will tell you he got his music from the folk music in his country, and then, did variations on it. So, I mean, that's a very good point you made, Rob, because there's another one. Astor Piazzolla in Argentina changed the tango, which was the music of his country. They used to beat him up on the street, literally beat him up for changing their music. Then 20, 30, 40 years later, they're selling coffee mugs with his picture on them and T-shirts because he's the hero of their country, because his music spread the tango across the world. So he changed the tango a little. It became popular, and they go, wow, we can cash in on this great Argentinian, the Argentine composer. But let's go right there. This is exactly what I wanted to talk about, and we led to it perfectly. That why do humans invent anything? Spoken word, printed word, pencils, cell phones. And McLuhan would say we're extending our humanness. So we invented clothing to extend our skin. And we invented cameras or movies to extend our eyelid, the shutter from the camera or a projector. And it goes on and on what we invented. McLuhan actually said we invented movies to extend our feet because we're traveling. So, this is metaphorical and poetic, and you can go anywhere with it. But he said the most human thing is technology, is the human invention. So back to Dillion, what did Thoreau and Emerson really mean? I mean, that's where Marshall got that from. The deep McLuhan thinkers trace it a lot to this quote of Emerson's, which I'm going to read right now, which is in The Laws of Media, the New Science by McLuhan. He quotes E.T. Hall in the book, The Silent Language. And he says, 2 generations ago, Emerson made the observation, the human body is the magazine of inventions, the patent office where are the models from which every hint was taken. All the tools and engines of earth are only extensions of limbs and senses. One definition of humans is an intelligence served by organs. So this idea of humans extending their humanness with inventions, it doesn't have to be a tangible invention. You can't hold philosophy in your hands, but humans invented it. So can you discuss a little, Dillion, where did Emerson, and then talk maybe a little about Thoreau, saying this is like nature, And McLuhan called it the new nature. So, what are we doing? We hear birds and we go, oh, we can do that with a guitar. We can make that sound. So, I mean, I'm bringing up a lot, but you can go wherever you want, Dillion, with this idea of extending humanness with inventions.
Well, to follow on and through with Stravinsky, the other big scandalous Stravinsky piece was what do you call it? L'Histoire du Soldat, the soldier story, where the music in that is maybe even more avant-garde. But this idea that creative artists have to introduce styles or techniques or even genres that are new. This is a 20th century thing. That was not characteristic of human culture for centuries and centuries. You wanted to do what had already been done successfully. It was not incumbent upon a creative artist to do something unprecedented. And the pressure to do that is so pervasive now that like in our time, we have artists, performance artists who will take off their clothes, smear their body with chocolate pudding, and roll around on a canvas because nobody's ever done it before. So if they want to be noticed by critics, they have to do something new. And I think that comes straight out of the Industrial Revolution when human mechanical inventiveness was transforming the economy. And of course, that happened in the nexus of the shift from a barter economy to a cash economy. And it goes right back to that first sentence from Emerson that I read. Build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. That's because people were inventing better mousetraps at that time.
Yeah.
And so if you look at Thoreau's family, Henry David Thoreau's father made pencils. That was his craft, and that was the family business. And just as Emerson did not want to go into the family business and become a minister, Thoreau did not want to go into the family business and make pencils. But for a year or two, if only to humor his father or help his parents out, he did. And he invented a whole new way to make a pencil. Right? They used to have the lead be turned or carved out of solid stone, graphite. And then the pencil was, the little shaft of wood would be sliced in half, hollowed out. You put the lead in there, which was a solid, and glue it all together and put a cap on it. But Thoreau invented a way to pulverize the graphite into dust and mix it with various kinds of paraffin or wax to make that much more easy. He injected the lead into the pencil, and it made it cheaper and quicker to make pencils, made his father's pencils more profitable. That was the age he lived in. And once he had done that, he moved on. But that whole attitude towards how are we going to radically rethink this and re-engineer it eventually got into the arts. The pressure to invent something innovative. But that didn't happen until the early 20th century.
Right, but a pencil has a hidden psychic effect. You can use a pencil to kill someone. But you're saying, well, once we invent something, we don't have control over the intention of the inventor. And it's funny that Thoreau he was an entrepreneur then. He was taking his death. And then he turned on that and says, I'm going to go live in the woods and ignore the business world, and I'm going to have no materials. Go ahead.
He did not ignore the business world at all. First of all, if you read Waldo, you notice that he's scavenging as much scrap as he can to build his hut. but he does a meticulous accounting of it as if it were a bookkeeper to figure out how much he's spending on it, because he's got a cash crop. He planted a big field of beans, and he intended to sell his beans on the cash economy market and clear enough to pay for his expenses, which he did. He made a profit on his beans. And so he says, I am determined to know beans, which is a play on that old expression, oh, he don't know beans about this or that. He said, I'm determined to know beans, and I'm also determined to market them and price them in such a way that I'll break even and pay my expenses of building my house, which he did.
But he's the poster boy for going into the woods and being a non-materialistic person.
I think people who say that don't understand it. And actually, when people do look into the archetype of Thoreau and realize he wasn't living in the wilderness, what a fraud. What a fraud. He used to go to his parents' house at least once a week to have dinner and have his mother do his laundry. What a fraud. But if you read Thoreau, he never claims to do that. He never claims that he's in the wilderness. And he's never claims that he's estranged from his family or alienated from his parents. He explains that he wants to get out on the edge of the community. He wants to get out on the periphery in order to have a better perspective of downtown. And Walden Pond was the periphery of Concord. And from there, he's still involved. He goes to town frequently, like when he was arrested for not paying his poll tax to support the war with Mexico. He got arrested because he went into town to pick up a shoe that had been repaired at the boot shop. He's not isolated from society. He just wants to be able to have a somewhat less stressed out, pressured vantage point to evaluate society from.
But this is good, Dylan. You're touching on exactly what I want to talk about is what's the function of civil disobedience then? Isn't he a poster boy for civil disobedience?
Certainly.
Okay, and explain that.
Well, what are you going to do? There's a war in Mexico, the purpose of which is to take Texas and California from Mexico, and the purpose of that is to expand the territory for slavery. So he's opposed, first of all, he's opposed to war. Secondly, he's opposed to slavery. And sort of implicitly, he's opposed to Texans. He doesn't like Texas. But he's in Concord, Massachusetts. What can he do? The only thing he can do is refuse to pay his taxes. So he does. So he gets arrested. He says, if you practice civil disobedience, the purpose of that is to bear the consequences. You actually make your statement by bearing the consequences. So if you update that, throw him ahead into the 20th century at the time of the war in Vietnam, he would say, if you're opposed to the war, your duty is not to run off to Sweden or run off to Canada. It's to stand where you are. Let's say you get conscripted, you're inducted, you're instructed to take a step forward. And when you do that, you're in the army. If you decline to take a step forward, you can be arrested. He said, you've got to stand and refuse induction. That is civil disobedience, knowing that you're going to go to jail. So it's same for him of refusing to pay his taxes. He knew there would be consequences. But if there weren't consequences, it wouldn't be civil disobedience.
You're saying civil disobedience works on a personal level, even though the collective can join in, But for civil disobedience to work, it's really on the personal level.
Yes, and if enough people do that, then the government does not have the funds to prosecute the war in Mexico.
Right. So, and it also sounds like civil disobedience isn't like, okay, we got to run tail and get out of here. It's being an appearance in, no, I'm not doing that. Like, it's like the kid in class who shows up just to be a dick, right?
Yeah.
It's not the kid who cancels class and doesn't
Right.
show up. He skips. It's the kid who's there and he just doesn't do anything. And the teacher's like, oh my God, that's kind of what Thoreau was doing. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's going to be a price to pay, and you got to be willing to pay it.
Yeah. Right.
But what can the humans today learn from Thoreau and Emerson in regards to civil disobedience? Because this is a huge issue right now. What do we do about these social issues? And what can we use from Thoreau's and Emerson's teachings that are applicable in a basic, down-to-earth, grassroots way?
Well, I would say, just in my own experience, let's say my own life, I have tended to work in the area of community arts and education. And specifically, I've tended to work for community arts centers. So it's been important to me to live in the community where I'm working. So that's easy if you're working in Concord, right? I have all these interests in the Transcendentalists and the Anti-Slavery Association amongst the women, and even the Revolutionary War, and there could be no better place for me. And I thought that when I took the job at Emerson Umbrella Center for the Arts, which is in an old abandoned high school building, which is leased from the town of Concord for $1 a year. That was my dream job, and I would be there for the rest of my career. But it didn't work out that way. But it felt like anything and everything I did for these progressive causes in my personal life, I had a very good platform for doing that from the Emerson umbrella. And that's been the case also from other suburban, affluent art centers where I was working. And I would say, in my own defense, I was working at those places to get my kids through their education. But ultimately, it felt more and more and more unsuitable, because I had never lost my basic interest in African Americans or Native Americans or other kinds of immigrants and refugees. In my personal life, I was doing what I could, let's say, with Haitian refugees or Somali refugees at the time. But I was offered a job at a community development corporation in inner city Boston, in Roxbury, the lowest income zip code in the state. And I said, that's where I should be. So I took that job. And when I took that job, I bought a new home in that neighborhood. And so when I moved into my place on Denison Street in Roxbury, my wife and I were the only white couple on that street. And, I actually knew some of the neighbors from other projects, and it was near the Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, which was in an old mansion from the 19th century in Roxbury. But I remember talking to an acquaintance on that street after we had moved in, and I said, I hope folks here don't think I'm the tip of the spear, like I'm the beginning of gentrification of somebody who's going to buy a place and flip it and move on. I'm here because I'm working in Dudley Square, and I'm here to stay. And he goes, well, for the neighbors, it all depends upon whether they're buying their home, they're owning their home with a mortgage, or if they're renting. Because if you own your home, they're saying about you moving in, well, there goes the neighborhood, meaning property values are now going to go up. If white folks are moving in, property values are going to go up. If they're renting, they're saying there goes the neighborhood, meaning if property values go up, they won't be able to afford the rent.
Yeah.
So whether I got happy smiles or dirty looks depended upon whether the neighbors are owning or renting.
Well, there's a lot of paradox to embrace, which I learned from Frank Zappa, embrace contradiction. I learned that most of the revolutions were started by rich, entitled kids because they could read the books by Mao and other revolutionaries, and then they could tell the working class, you've got to raise up for your rights. And the working class were too busy working to be able to read these books.
Right.
The movie Berkeley in the 60s, and the Black Panthers are going, yeah, we used to go to Chinatown and buy Miles' red book for a nickel and then sell it to all the hippies for $5. And then he says, eventually I read the book and it was really a good book. So Dillion, this is beautiful where you've led us, because I wanted to get into storytelling, and that's what you're good at, and being able to spend time with you in the past. And I've always been grateful is that you know how to story tell or be narrative. And just a basic, let's start with Rob so he keeps it involved. Is storytelling more innate or more invented by humans? So it's back to this thing of why humans invent anything. So we'll go with Rob first. What is it, Rob? Is
Stories are invented.
It's storytelling. No, the act of storytelling is more invented by humans. Okay. Go ahead, Dillion.
I don't know.
But I mean,
it happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, I think like what Rob said earlier about language, what was essential to the development of the creative arts. I think that storytelling is central to the development of language, that there is a narrative faculty which involves what's known as time binding. You can't tell a story unless you have a concept of the past and the present.
Yeah.
And I don't know about the future, but a story is a narrative through time in which time elapses in a sequence of events. And supposedly, animals do not have this. Other mammals do not have this faculty, which is why a dog cannot tell you a story.
Yeah. Well, both Frank Zappa and James Joyce say all times are happening now. So we invented this idea of, well, we're going to have this Zoom session at 9:30 a.m. when in essence, this discussion goes on in our heads in and out for our whole life. But if we just zoomed in through this invention of spoken word, and basically this is a live TV show. That's what we're experiencing right now. So, to touch on this, I want to touch back on nature. Is it innate in humans to have language, or did humans invent language? And Dillion, you've studied semiotics. Can you go on that a little? Did humans, and Chomsky, did humans invent language, or is it innate in humans?
I studied semiotics at Indiana University with Thomas Siviak, who was a key figure in 20th century semiotics. And I got in trouble on the first day of seminar when he said that language is an organ of the brain. And I raised my hand and said, excuse me, there is no organ for language. There is no, in the sense of physiology and anatomy, there is no organ for language. You know, you would have to be a specialist to dissect the brain of an orangutan and dissect the brain of a human and tell the difference. You can't point to any locus, any lobe, and, you know, although beginning to map out the brain in more detail at that time. And he just looked at me and said, language is an organ of the brain. Figure it out, you know. So, but he was saying that, yes, there is a natural capacity that humans have for language. It's innate and it's organic.
And that's what Chomsky says too, right?
You tell me.
Yeah, I think he does.
I saw a video on YouTube and it kind of blew my mind. And it was this, I believe it was a gorilla. I forget the name of the gorilla, but they taught it sign language. And then I saw this other video of this gorilla, and this really blew my mind. The gorilla was telling the story about these captives. Now, to what level was this indoctrinated? Like, were they, you know, really coaching this animal to say what it was saying? But it was recounting a story of it being chased and of his, because it was a male primate, his parents being killed by poachers. And it was the most mind-boggling thing I had ever seen, because here's an animal who we're told as human beings that we're so superior and we're so much better, and that we have feelings and other animals don't. That's why we eat fish and we eat cows. And then, of course, my counter argument to that is, well, hey, you know, you vegans, you do realize that flowers they reach out to the sun to try and get energy. So I'm pretty sure flowers just might have feelings too. So out of here with that. But anyways, this animal was telling us, recounting a tale that was horrific. I have to send you that clip because it's mind-boggling.
But Rob, it's simple. It's
right.
Something Dillion touched on. You're anthropomorphizing human language onto the animal. So I've studied all those.
But the animal was using sign language to tell
because of what the human is translating their signals with. We're anthropomorphizing.
Yes.
We, like Dillion said, we don't talk the language of animals because we don't know if they have what we consider language. We know.
You know, Thomas Seviak, this semiotician at IU, he got all involved in this controversy, and he engaged in debates with Rumba, I think was the name of the researcher. And I think the first gorilla was Coco.
Yes.
K-O-K-O, Coco. Yeah. And he finally had to concede that particular gorilla could learn some signs from a human being and could point to specific icons on an array of signs in order to tell a story. He did eventually have to concede that.
Yeah.
But of course, his point was, this is not a troop of wild gorillas living out in the Congo. This is a laboratory animal who has been raised by humans, who has a good relationship with these particular humans, who learned some signs with them and learned how to gesture.
Yeah. But what if Coco was released back into the wild and Coco taught the other primates how to communicate?
What a huge, huge question. That's like saying probably humans didn't get culture amongst themselves. They got it from space aliens.
Right.
Yeah. And Coco could say, I got this from these space aliens who taught me how to do
draw
this.
hieroglyphs of
Right. Right.
That was
the straight backs, the humans.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, the great answer, Lily Tomlin and Jane Wagner, her partner, they asked, why did humans invent language? She said, to complain. And, you know, this is like, what's the difference, Dillion, between complaining and critical thinking?
I don't know. It's like, critical thinking is supposed to be rational, incisive, sequential, and I would think of complaining as being more inspired by emotion,
Yeah,
by feeling. So complaining is like whining in words, but a dog can whine just like a human can whine.
yeah. Well, that leads us to this narrative in storytelling conundrum, because Hollis Frampton, the great experimental filmmaker, said that narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. So, McLuhan summed up advertising as three things: sex, death, and technology. So I think that applies to the human condition. Sex is feeling, what you just brought up, emotion, impulse, intuition. Death is time. We think we know what happens. When you die, that's the end of your physical body. We want to think that's what happens. No one knows what happens after death. So there's the establishment of time is through we're waiting to die. And technology is anything humans invent that we put in between spoken word, printed word, song, Zoom sessions. So my friend who I study Finnegan's Wake with, she said, our duty is to invent new myths and new narratives and new stories. So like you explained that earlier, Dillion, that humans in this mechanical age started doing newness. Igor Stravinsky, Marcel Duchamp, James Joyce, even, let's bring a woman in there, the hero, Silent Spring writer, Rachel Carson. She wrote a book that shook people and said, hey, be aware, they're spraying stuff on your plants and it's probably not good for your body. So this was, she put in a book form, and I know there's a difference between fiction and nonfiction, but this whole idea of new myths goes to Willa Cather, who said, there's only 3 or 4 myths. And then a friend told me the other day, a philosopher said, there's only 2 myths. There's the journey myth and the creation myth. So can you just talk on that idea of narrative being the animal necessity of the spirit because we're waiting to die, and maybe bring in what Thoreau and Emerson thought about death in storytelling?
Well, if you look at traditional European folk tales, right? The first way of studying those, like the Grimm's brothers, was what they called the historic geographic method. Where did these stories come from? When and how did they disseminate? Where are they distributed now? Let's compare different tellings from different regions and see how the elements of the story, which are called motifs, compare. So the conclusion of that period of study was that they originated in the Indus River Valley in India, and they disseminated east, north, and west into Asia and Europe, and were pretty much in place by the 15th century. But they're not about life and death. They're about who are you going to marry. So all the tale types, if you think of those classic ones, even ones that have been adapted into pop culture, like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White,
Knight in Shining Armor,
they end with a wedding, which implies that all stories are coming of age stories. Or let's say all interesting stories are coming of age stories. And so very often these tales, and there are Russian formalist analysts who said that all stories are comprised of, let's say, 21 different functions. First function, there's a hero. He's still living at home. One or both of his parents are missing. Oftentimes it's a father who has died. Therefore, he sets out on his journey. Along the way, he meets various kinds of guides and helpers. Eventually, he encounters the villain. He has to overcome the villain. Oftentimes, it's by satisfying the demands of a king who has a beautiful princess daughter, and in the end, he marries the princess. They always come in the same sequence. So if you study European folktales like that, that's the kind of, it moved on from the historic geographic method to the functional, like how do these function in society and why are they good for the brain? Like, why are these stories good to think with? But the whole implication is that once you decide on whom you're going to marry, which implies that you're going to marry, it implies that you're heterosexual and you're looking for a spouse. Once you decide who you're going to have for a spouse and what you're going to do for a living, the story is over. You're just going to coast out on that for the rest of your life. So for most people, their story ends by the time they're 20 or 21. So obviously, if you get into the 20th century, that's not good enough. That's not a sufficient story to be all stories. Maybe we don't sit around the fireplace and tell folk tales, but even if you go to a live theater to hear, Spalding Gray, or you go to a poetry reading to hear Anne Sexton read, or you go to the movies to describe our circumstances in our lives, you need a whole new different set of plots and outcomes. But there's still a belief, particularly amongst Hollywood screenwriters, that, and a lot of them followed Joseph Campbell in this, and the hero's quest or whatever, that there are only 7 plots, or there are only 5 plots, or whatever. And most Hollywood movies end with the consummation of a romance, whether it ends in a wedding, formal wedding or not. That basic story of courting, seducing, embracing, accepting another person in a romance is the most popular storytelling.
Yeah, I think you just summarize Rob's life metaphorically, right, Rob?
What was that? Sorry.
Yeah, I think what Dillion was summarizing talked a lot about what's happened in your life and what kind of journey you're on with this show.
Yeah, definitely. Although I'm
wrong about everything, and you're trying to seek out like smart-ass people like me to tell you, then I lure wise people like Dillion in, and he lays it down.
Yes. You're the Obi-Wan Kenobi. but isn't that the truth, that we're all the heroes, hopefully, in our own stories? And I also think about how Dillion was mentioning that this is the archetypical story. This is the formation of the Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey. Those are the movies that we love to rewatch. But movies like what was that one that Martin Scorsese did where everybody dies and you're like, well, that was a great movie, but there's no fucking way I'm watching that again, right? Because it's not a feel-good movie, but it's a nuanced sort of plot development, right? Or that other one, Manchester by the Sea, and you're like, thank you, The Departed, somebody just mentioned, yeah. So the Departed, and then there's Manchester by the Sea, and you're like, that was a great human film. There's no way I'm ever going to watch that again, right? And again, it's because it speaks to our own mortality. Whereas a lot of these hero journeys, they're not actually completed. Like the Epic of Gilgamesh, he dies at the end, doesn't he? Right?
Yes.
And in Beowulf, he dies in the end. And that's why it's such a long story that they would tell over the course of many, campfires and stuff, because I don't know if anyone's ever heard Beowulf, but like, it takes a while to get there. And also in these stories, like you're saying, Dillion was saying, that it tries to educate us of the values and virtues of the time. So
Right. But
is that the point of stories, is to teach us the values and virtues of the time?
Well, and often to lead. Right? There are no traditional European folktales about a homosexual couple or lesbians. There are none about an unhappy marriage that ends in divorce. There's none about discrimination and persecution of dwarves. Dwarves are always cute and helpful.
And heels.
And yes. So, yeah, in our time, if you think of the early movies that featured a homosexual couple, they were instructional. They were telling the general public, you don't have to be afraid of this, and you don't need to condemn it, and you don't need to outlaw it. It's all going to be okay. It's all going to be okay.
Well, it's also kind of what William Blake was saying during the period of abolition. I mean, talk about a progressive of his time in like the 18th century. He was talking about like, black slaves. They're our brothers, right? And this is during a time when not many people thought that way. But he was trying to convey a message. He was the counterculture.
Yes. Blake, I'm not familiar with his writing on slavery like that, but he was start to finish countercultural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blake also resonates with McLuhan. He says, we become what we behold. So, that's sort of like, again, how these things we make, we invent, extend us. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say, what my mind has been trying to recount the whole time is the concept of, is it Deus ex machina? Is that how you say it? And it's this idea that we create something that it becomes God. Mm-hmm. That the idea that technology, that, Terminator is Deus ex machina, that we create something and Skynet has become self-aware, right? And then we're all like, oh my God. But this is not a new conception. I think Deus ex machina dates way, like it's one of the original stories, that we create something that it becomes our master.
Well, to try to get back to Emerson and Thoreau, as we conclude, they had very different experiences of death. At that time, life expectancy was not what it is today, largely because childhood mortality was so high that the average life was, they would say if you lived to be 50, your odds were very good of living into old age. But there were so many things that could get you before 50. And in their time, the main thing was tuberculosis, or what they would call consumption. It's very common and no treatment for it at all. So Thoreau was in his early 40s and he caught a cold and it developed into pneumonia and developed into tuberculosis. Or he came to realize he had tuberculosis and he had a very limited prognosis. So he was fully aware of that. He had his mental faculties as he died. And he was cared for by his younger sisters at the parents' house, and he was in his familiar bedroom. And the story goes that, well, there are two famous anecdotes about his death. One is he was visited by an abolitionist colleague. Pillsbury Parker maybe, who said, can you see over to the other side? Like thinking of the river of Seth, again, from ancient mythology. Can you see over to the afterlife? Can you tell us what to expect? And Thoreau said, one world at a time. But the other thing was that he was fully aware of the progression of the disease. Everybody was familiar with people who had died of consumption, And so his sister was sitting by his bedside, and she was reading to him his first published book, which was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was a story of when he and his brother John took a boat up the Concord to Nashua, up the Merrimack, all the way up into the White Mountains. And when they had to, they rowed, but when they could, they sailed. They put it was like a rowboat, but they put a mast up and a sail. So if you were rowing upstream, it was very hard and slow going. But if you were sailing downstream, it was very smooth and easy. And so his sister is reading A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers to him. And they come to the point where they turn and they head towards home. And Thoreau said, now comes good sailing. And that was the last, I think it was the last complete sentence he said, So that's, he was, again, fully aware of what was happening. On the other hand, Emerson died of dementia. He had a very long, gradual slide into Alzheimer's disease, which started, his daughters noticed changes even during the Civil War. And by 1868, it was clear that he was declining. And he lived for another 20 years until 1888, I believe, or maybe 82. Anyway, into the 1880s. And he just gradually lost it and lost his self-consciousness. And for years, he would get up at the same time every morning, get dressed, have breakfast, go to his study, and sit there at his desk. And first he could write a paragraph, but not a complete essay. Then he could write a sentence, but not a complete paragraph. And then eventually he would just write little fragmentary phrases and finally single words. So there is, when I was working on my album called Willow of the Wilderness, which is all Emerson's poetry, I had access to his manuscript notebooks at Harvard. And I wrote out these random fragmentary phrases and finally words towards the end. And I put those together into a coherent song. That's that song, Old Age. It's his last few pages of his manuscript notebooks. And he talks about losing his mind, losing his memory and his self-awareness and his consciousness. He says, my poor mind has broke in one mind. So he slipped away, but Thoreau had a culminating crisis of a disease.
Wow, so well put, Ellen, and we appreciate your time. We'll just wrap up here with two quotes and your reactions to them. And again, thanks, Rob, for facilitating and your input too. This is Barrington Nevitt, who was an associate of McLuhan. He said that, like Thoreau, the Eastern philosophers believe that we can return to nature as in past times to become merely an extension of nature, But this is impossible once humans begin to make a new nature, which is not necessarily something we like, but something we are responsible for. So McLuhan would say the new nature is not us sitting around a campfire and doing this. It's us sitting around a Zoom session and getting eye contact and exchanging verbal, exchange. So, Dylan, how do we cope with what we don't like about the new nature? The cartoon is the kid comes out of the room and they're on a cell phone. The new nature is a different thing. How do we cope with it?
Go to the woods.
Go to the woods.
That was the subtitle of Walden, it's the Walden or Life in the Woods.
Is it really?
Yeah. Here's what Emerson said. I think he would say this, that for him, the new nature is a result of scientific research. He wants to understand nature from a scientific point of view, not from a mythological point of view, so that he can ultimately realize how those two things are the same. So he said, this is what he said, a scientific fact is like one word. And I want to put together all the words, all these new scientific facts that were emerging, not so I can learn a new grammar, but so that I can read the book. He wants to fully understand the book of nature. Yeah. So that is both language and science and self-consciousness and wisdom all coming together.
Yeah. So
unfortunately, then he became demented.
Well, no, I would just interject, Dylan, you put it as dementia is bad. I think that how humans work is we return to being a child. So I know I'm losing my memory now, but they say if you look at your keys, you lose your keys, your forgetfulness is increasing. If you look at your keys and go, what are these for? Then you're like in trouble. Well, I don't think you're in trouble. You're just changed and you're going back to being a child. And, we can put negativeness on it, but it's also like, hey, the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can. That's all. You're just doing as well as you can. When my dad was, 95 and had dementia, my mom would catch him crying sometimes because he knew he was losing it. Yeah. But I spent 8 days with him, and it was the best 8 days of my life, where I was with him all 24 hours. And, it was just wonderful because he knew he had a backpedal to try to figure out things, but it was just being bare bones and real. So I know it can be put into a negative framing, but it's also like that's the way of the world and we can't really change it.
Well, it's the way of the world because our life expectancy has extended so much.
Very good.
For all those hundreds of thousands of years where most people had been eaten by a saber-toothed tiger by the time they were 40, we never had to worry about dementia. Dementia seems to be maladaptive,
right,
from the point of view of Darwinian evolution. And I'm sorry, you got a big job not to convince me that it's not a tragedy in an individual life.
Yeah, I know.
But it's actually a new thing that we have to cope with.
Yeah.
Death versus the process of dying.
Yes, because of the success of medical science. Yeah. Emerson and Thoreau and all those guys, Margaret Fuller, they all love to make fun of Longfellow. Because they felt his poetry was too predictable, too regular, and too trite. His poems always scanned and rhymed perfectly. And so to them, it was, doesn't matter if it's triple or duple. It's like this is the forest primeval, the beginning of Hiawatha, or listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Bori. To the transcendentalists, that was just boring. So when Longfellow died and Emerson's daughters took him to the funeral, he was slipping away, and he saw Longfellow in the casket, and he said, "Who is the sleeper?" He didn't know who he was, and he didn't even fully comprehend that he was dead. He just said, "Who is the sleeper?" Now, to me, these two had been rivals and adversaries their whole careers. And to me, it's sad that Emerson lost it to the extent that he didn't recognize his primary antagonist in life.
No, Dillion, that's the beauty, is that he didn't. Who's the sleeper? It's total waking. I'm reading Dante with the Sweeney's Pharmacy reading group in Dublin online, and we use the Longfellow translation. And it's funny because I didn't know that about Longfellow, and now I do. But it's like how we perceive. It's all about perception, and how we integrate it with conception. So you put the puzzle pieces so well together for us today, and I'm so grateful. But also, you also said things like, "I don't know." Like I go, "Rob, we're going to the wise man on." It's like you go to the guru and you go, "So what's the best question I can ask you?" And the guru goes, "The one you just asked me."
Yeah. What is the meaning of life? I have no idea.
So,
Well,
Rob, go ahead, though.
I just want to say, if we're speaking of gorillas, I am now a silverback, and I have to own that. I have to claim it. I'm a silverback.
Great.
And what does that mean?
Well, gorillas turn gray. They get gray hairs. So the elder males, who probably are no longer the apex ape in the troop, they've been displaced by younger males, but primatologists call them silverbacks.
Yeah. It sounds slick. Okay, you've taken up a lot of your time, Dillion. We're super grateful. Rob, you got one more question or comment, and then I got a closing quote. So thanks again. Go ahead, Rob. You got anything else you want to?
I wonder what Thoreau would say about how we live today, in the sense that we do the polar opposite of what he does. We go hiking to get respite. We go into nature, much like he went into the city. What he was going to the city for different reasons, to get his mom to do his laundry. But the idea that we are doing the opposite of what he's saying, that we live in the cities. And what did he say to that? To how, or what would he presumptuously say to how we live today?
I think he would repeat one of his assertions in Walden, which is, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. Yes. However, Thoreau didn't like real wilderness. Like he went to Maine more than once looking for wilderness. And when he finally got to the top of Mount Katahdin, he had a nervous breakdown. He didn't like that elevation or that remoteness or that ruggedness. He wanted to be on the edge of Concord.
Yeah. He wanted tamed wilderness.
That's right.
Which is an oxymoron, right? Because for anybody, I'm a hunter and I go way out there and you hear the trees go, and your mind thinks, holy shit, there's a big cat there. Right? And you have one down the barrel, right? Versus when you go to a park and you're like, oh, look, a squirrel, isn't that cute?
Right. So while he was at Walden, the railroad tracks were built right past and they were built by immigrant Irish labor. The world was changing, society was changing, the pond was changing. But so what he's really saying is that wilderness is a frame of mind. It's a mood that you can access. He couldn't pretend that Walden was the wilderness, but still it was doing for him what he needed it to do.
It's really well put, Dylan. That's what I learned when I was a kid watching Burt Lancaster and Birdman of Alcatraz. It doesn't matter where you are. You can work things out. He's in jail and he's having fun raising the birds that fly into his cell. So in closing, this book came out 20 years ago. When computers exceed human intelligence, the age of spiritual machines, and it's got a lot of cool quotes that I can talk about, but it's flipping things in my opinion. So people are scared of artificial intelligence, AI, like Rob brings it up to how are we going to deal with us becoming, we became, like Mark Twain said, when you got a hammer in your hand, everything looked like a nail. We're just extending ourselves. It's no different having a cell phone or using spoken word or printed word, blah, blah, blah. So I say flip AI into IA, which is McLuhan's integral awareness. Integrate everything and have an awareness of it. So Dylan, in closing, here's the quote that he puts in his book, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Cannot we let people be themselves and enjoy in their own way? You are trying to make another one. One's enough. What did Emerson mean by that?
Could you read it again?
Yeah, because it is funny. I think what I picked is because Walt Whitman says we become multitudes. Aren't we all just one organism? Are we really all individuals? But I don't know if that's what Emerson's saying. Here we go. Cannot we let people be themselves and enjoy life in their own way? You are trying to make another you. One's enough.
Oh, so whoever he's speaking to, you're saying if you want other people to conform to the way you want to do it, you're trying to make another you?
Yeah.
Leave him alone and let him do what he wants?
Yeah.
To me, that speaks to individuality, and self-reliance of, and maybe the essence of American democracy is allowing people to find their own way and be themselves.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is the word self-reliance came up so much in me studying Thoreau and Emerson for this salon, is that they're sort of like, it seems like they're saying, well, you're an individual, but really it's community that's important. It's sharing with other humans that's important. Like my philosophy is the reason we invented spoken word or printed word or electronic word is so that we have something to put between us and other people.
Well, when Emerson spoke of self-reliance, he was not talking about human society or the economy or how to make your livelihood. Or what he meant by self-reliance is every person has the innate faculty to find God by themselves. That's part of his argument that you don't need organized religion. It's rely on yourself to know God. That's what Emerson meant by self-reliance.
And maybe kind of to that, perhaps to your point, but there's the intrinsic and the extrinsic pursuits of individuality. And it's like parents who they hear their kid listen to heavy metal music. Why are you listening to that? And they're like, I want to listen to more of it, right? It's like that's sort of the extrinsic influences for individuality. But when parents are like, hey, that's really cool, keep doing that, then they find the intrinsic pursuits of individuality, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that's that higher functioning, right? And that's when they can get to that transcendentalism, is when they're pursuing the intrinsic pursuits of individuality versus I want to be different. But in order to be different, you have to count on resistance.
Yes.
But once you don't have any resistance, it's like this. Was it the Zapatitas, or they stormed Mexico City and everybody just fled, and they were there and they're like, well, so now what? And then they just left the next day, right? There was no resistance. They got what they wanted, but they realized it wasn't what they wanted. That was the extrinsic pursuits, not the intrinsic pursuits. Is that sort of what Thoreau was after?
Certainly.
Well, that might be a good word to end on. We got Dillion to be certain instead of not saying.
I'm still probably wrong about everything.
What a way to end the show. I'm probably wrong about everything.
Thank you, Dillion. Thank you,
You're
Gerry.
welcome.
Thank you, watchers.
Dillion, thank you, but Rob, I love you guys.
I love you too. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.